Last night's episode of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was supposed to be a standard book promotion appearance. Meghan Markle had arrived at the Ed Sullivan Theatre to discuss her latest memoir. But what started as pleasantries quickly devolved into something far more sinister. The atmosphere in the studio felt different from the moment the cameras started rolling. Colbert, known for his sharp wit and ability to navigate even the most difficult interviews with grace, seemed unusually tense as he introduced his guest to the live audience. "Please welcome to the show, Meghan Markle," Colbert announced with his trademark smile, though those paying close attention could detect something strained beneath his usual charm. The applause was polite but not overwhelming, a telling sign of the divided public opinion that seems to follow Markle wherever she goes. She walked onto the stage wearing an elegant black dress, her posture confident, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was ready for battle rather than a friendly chat about her book. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough. Colbert asked about her writing process, her inspirations, the usual softball questions that guests expect when they're promoting their latest project. Markle answered with practiced ease, her responses feeling rehearsed and calculated, but experienced. Viewers of late-night television could sense something brewing beneath the surface. The way she held herself, the slight edge in her voice when she emphasized certain words, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. It all pointed to someone who had come prepared for more than just a book promotion. "So, Meghan," Colbert said, leaning back in his chair with that deceptively casual pose he adopts when he's about to probe deeper, "in your book, you talk extensively about the media's treatment of you and your family. You've made some pretty serious accusations about how certain outlets have covered your story. Do you think there's any possibility that some of the criticism you've faced might have been warranted?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. The studio audience, which had been murmuring softly among themselves, fell completely silent. Markle's smile faltered for just a moment, barely perceptible to most, but Colbert caught it. Her hands, which had been resting casually in her lap, suddenly gripped the arms of her chair. "Stephen," she said, her voice taking on a tone that was both condescending and defensive, "I think that question reveals exactly the kind of unconscious bias that I've been fighting against my entire life. The idea that I should somehow accept warranted criticism when that criticism has been rooted in racism, sexism, and classism is frankly insulting." Colbert's eyebrows raised slightly. He had expected pushback, but the force of her response, and the way she had immediately played multiple discrimination cards, seemed excessive for what had been a relatively measured question. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the playful banter they had come to expect from late-night television. "I wasn't suggesting you should accept unfair criticism," Colbert replied, his voice remaining calm but with a slight edge creeping in. "I was asking whether you think any of the coverage might have been legitimate journalism rather than persecution. There's a difference between racist attacks and legitimate questions about public figures' actions and statements." Markle's eyes flashed with something that looked dangerously close to fury. She leaned forward in her chair, her voice rising slightly. "So now you're suggesting that I can't tell the difference between legitimate journalism and persecution? That's incredibly patronizing, Stephen. I've lived this experience. I've seen how the press operates when they want to destroy someone, especially someone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of acceptability." The tension in the studio was becoming impossible to ignore. Colbert, who had navigated interviews with everyone from controversial politicians to disgraced celebrities, was clearly taken aback by the hostility in Markle's response. He glanced briefly at his producers in the wings, a move that eagle-eyed viewers would later dissect frame by frame on social media. "Meghan, I think there might be a misunderstanding here," Colbert said, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "I'm not questioning your ability to interpret your own experiences. I'm simply trying to understand your perspective on the difference between unfair treatment and legitimate scrutiny that comes with being a public figure." But rather than de-escalating the situation, His attempt at diplomacy seemed to fuel Markle's anger even further. She sat back in her chair with a look that could only be described as incredulous, shaking her head slowly as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice now carrying a sharp edge that cut through the studio's silence like a knife. "The gaslighting, the suggestion that I'm somehow misinterpreting my own lived experience, the implication that I should be grateful for any coverage at all because I'm a public figure. Do you have any idea what it's like to have your every move scrutinized, your every word twisted, your every facial expression analyzed for hidden meaning?" Colbert was clearly struggling to maintain his composure. The interview was spiraling out of control, and he could feel it slipping away from him with each passing moment. But rather than backing down, something in Markle's accusatory tone seemed to trigger his own defensive instincts. "Actually, Meghan," he said, his voice taking on a sharper quality than his audience had ever heard before, "I do know what it's like to have every word scrutinized. I've been doing this job for years, and I've faced my share of criticism and controversy. The difference is that I don't assume every piece of negative coverage is rooted in discrimination. Sometimes people just disagree with your choices or your statements." The moment those words left his mouth, everyone in the studio knew that the conversation had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Markle's face transformed completely, her practiced media smile disappearing entirely to reveal something much more raw and dangerous underneath. The carefully crafted public persona that she had spent years developing seemed to crack right there on live television, and what emerged was something that would change the trajectory of the entire evening. "How dare you?" Markle hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than if she had shouted. "How dare you sit there and minimize what I've been through? You have no idea what it's like to be a woman of color, in the public eye, to have your character assassinated daily by people who have never met you, who have decided that you're the villain in a story they've written without your input." The studio audience was frozen in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing a breakdown or a calculated performance. Some began to shift uncomfortably, the tension becoming almost unbearable to watch. Colbert, who had faced down politicians and controversial figures with ease, found himself in uncharted territory. This wasn't political theater or professional sparring. This felt personal and venomous in a way that made everyone present deeply uncomfortable. "Meghan, I never said anything about your race or gender," Colbert replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He was clearly rattled by the intensity of her response and the way she had immediately weaponized identity politics to shut down any criticism. "I was simply suggesting that not all criticism is necessarily discriminatory. Sometimes people disagree with actions or statements regardless of who's making them." But Markle was having none of it. She leaned forward aggressively, her eyes blazing with an anger that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than this single conversation. "Oh, please, don't give me that colorblind nonsense. When you're a white man in media, you get to decide what constitutes legitimate criticism and what doesn't. You get to sit in judgment of people like me and pretend that your perspective is somehow neutral and objective." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Colbert's face flushed slightly, and for the first time in the interview, his famous composure cracked completely. The suggestion that he was somehow racist or that his questions were motivated by racial bias clearly struck a nerve that went to the core of how he saw himself as a journalist and a person. "That's completely unfair," he said, his voice rising. For the first time in the interview, "I've spent my entire career fighting against discrimination and inequality. I've given a platform to countless voices that have been marginalized by mainstream media. To suggest that I'm somehow motivated by racial bias because I asked you a standard question that I would ask any public figure is not only wrong, it's destructive to the very causes you claim to champion." The gloves were now completely off. What had started as a book promotion had transformed into a full-scale ideological battle, with both participants clearly feeling that their fundamental identities and values were under attack. The producers in the wings were frantically signaling, but both Colbert and Markle seemed oblivious to everything except their escalating confrontation. "Standard question?" Markle laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter contempt. "Would you ask a white male author whether his criticism of unfair media coverage was warranted? Would you suggest that maybe Prince William should just accept negative press coverage because he's a public figure? Or is this special treatment reserved for women who don't know their place?" The comparison to Prince William was a masterstroke of manipulation, and everyone in the studio knew it. By invoking her brother-in-law, she had just dragged the entire royal family drama into what was supposed to be a literary interview. Colbert's jaw visibly tightened as he realized he was being cornered into a no-win situation where any response would be twisted into evidence of bias. "This has nothing to do with the royal family," he said through gritted teeth, "and everything to do with the fact that you seem incapable of accepting that anyone might have legitimate concerns about your behavior without it being rooted in discrimination. That's not empowerment, Meghan. That's manipulation." The word manipulation hit Markle like a physical blow. Her entire body went rigid, and for a moment it looked like she might actually stand up and walk off the set right then and there. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, with the audience holding its collective breath as they waited to see how she would respond to such a direct accusation. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice-cold and deadly calm. "So now I'm manipulative for pointing out discrimination. Interesting. Tell me, Stephen, when men advocate for themselves and push back against unfair treatment, what do you call that? Leadership? Strength? But when a woman does it, suddenly, she's manipulative. When a woman of color does it, she's playing the race card." Colbert was clearly struggling to maintain control of the interview. Every attempt he made to steer the conversation back to reasonable ground was met with increasingly aggressive accusations and personal attacks. The professional distance that usually exists between host and guest had completely evaporated, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to genuine hatred. "You're putting words in my mouth," he said, but his voice betrayed his frustration. "I never said anything about your gender or race determining your behavior. I'm talking about your actions and your statements, not your identity. The fact that you keep trying to make this about discrimination rather than addressing the actual issues suggests that maybe the criticism isn't as unfounded as you claim." It was a risky move, and Colbert knew it the moment the words left his mouth. He had essentially accused her of using identity politics as a shield to avoid accountability, and given her reaction to much milder suggestions, he braced himself for the explosion that was sure to follow. Markle's response was swift and brutal. "There it is," she said, pointing at him with a perfectly manicured finger that somehow looked more like a weapon than a gesture. "The real Stephen Colbert, everyone. Scratch the surface of any liberal man, and you'll find the same condescending attitude toward women who refuse to be silenced. You're no different from the tabloid editors who've been trying to destroy me from day one." The comparison to tabloid editors was particularly cutting because it struck at Colbert's professional identity as a legitimate journalist and comedian. The suggestion that he was no better than the scandal-mongering press that he had spent years criticizing in his comedy was clearly designed to wound him where it would hurt most, and judging by the look on his face, it had hit its mark perfectly. "That's enough," Colbert said, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge that his longtime viewers had never heard before. "I've tried to be respectful. I've tried to give you a fair platform to tell your story, but you've turned this into a personal attack on my character and my integrity. If you can't handle basic questions about your public statements without accusing everyone of racism and sexism, then maybe the problem isn't with the media coverage. Maybe the problem is with you." The studio fell into a stunned silence. Colbert had just delivered what amounted to a devastating personal attack on live television, something that went against every principles of professional interview conduct. The audience didn't know whether to gasp, applaud, or simply sit in shocked silence at what they had just witnessed. But they didn't have long to process it, because Markle's response was immediate and nuclear. She stood up so abruptly that her chair actually rocked backward, her face contorted with a rage that was both terrifying and mesmerizing to watch. For a moment she towered over Colbert, who remained seated, clearly not expecting such a dramatic physical response to his words. The power dynamic in the studio shifted completely as she loomed over him, her entire body radiating fury. "You want to know what the problem is?" she said, her voice rising to a level that bordered on shouting. "The problem is men like you who think they can sit in judgment of women like me while hiding behind the pretense of objective journalism. You're nothing but another privileged white man who can't handle it when someone refuses to play by your rules." The racial accusation delivered with such venom sent shockwaves through the studio. Several audience members audibly gasped, while others began whispering among themselves. This had crossed every line of acceptable television discourse, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. Colbert, still seated but clearly shaken by her towering presence and the intensity of her attack, tried to maintain some semblance of professional composure. "Meghan, please sit down. Let's try to have a civil conversation about this." "Civil?" She laughed, but it was a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "You want civil after you just told me that I'm the problem? After you essentially called me a liar about my own experiences with discrimination? There's nothing civil about what you've done here tonight, Stephen. You've shown your true colors, and they're uglier than I even imagined." The accusation that he had called her a liar was the final straw for Colbert. His own temper, which he had been struggling to control throughout the increasingly hostile interview, finally snapped completely. He stood up abruptly, bringing himself to eye level with his guest, his face flushed with anger and indignation. "I never called you a liar," he said, his voice now matching her volume and intensity. "But I'm starting to think that maybe some of those media reports had a point. If this is how you react to basic questions, if this is how you treat people who are trying to give you a fair platform, then maybe the problem really isn't with everyone else." The suggestion that the negative media coverage might have been justified was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. Markle's eyes widened with what could only be described as pure hatred, and for a moment it looked like she might actually physically lunge at him. The security personnel positioned around the studio visibly tensed, clearly prepared to intervene if the situation escalated beyond verbal confrontation. "How dare you validate the lies and propaganda that have been used to destroy my reputation?" she seethed, pointing an accusatory finger directly at his face. "You're no better than the trolls and racists who hide behind keyboards to attack me online. At least they're honest about their hatred. You hide yours behind false civility and pretend it's journalism." The comparison to online trolls and racists was the most damaging blow she could have delivered to Colbert's reputation and self-image. The suggestion that his questions were motivated by the same hatred that drove anonymous internet harassment was designed to be career-ending, and everyone in the studio understood the implications of what she had just said. "That's completely out of line," Colbert shot back, his voice now shaking with rage. "I've devoted my entire career to fighting against the very forces you're accusing me of representing. To suggest that I'm motivated by racism or hatred is not only false, it's defamatory, and you know it." But Markle was beyond caring about the consequences of her words. The careful media training that had guided her through years of public appearances had completely abandoned her, replaced by raw emotion and a desire to inflict maximum damage on the man she now clearly viewed as an enemy. "Defamatory?" she repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "You want to talk about defamation? You've spent the last 20 minutes trying to gaslight me into believing that the discrimination I've faced isn't real, that the attacks on my character are somehow justified. You've used your platform to legitimize the very forces that have been trying to destroy me and my family. The mention of her family seemed to trigger something even deeper in her anger. Her voice became even more shrill and accusatory as she continued her assault on Colbert's character and professional reputation. "You know what this really is?" she continued, her voice rising to levels that were painful to listen to. "This is exactly the kind of systematic oppression that women of color face every single day. When we speak up for ourselves, we're called aggressive. When we defend our families, we're called manipulative. When we refuse to accept discrimination, we're told we're the problem." Colbert was clearly at his breaking point. The sustained personal attack, the accusations of racism, and the suggestion that he was part of some systematic oppression had pushed him beyond his ability to maintain any pretense of professional conduct. His face was red with anger and frustration as he prepared to deliver what would be his final response. "You know what, Meghan?" he said, his voice deadly calm in a way that was somehow more menacing than shouting. "I think this interview is over. I've tried to be respectful. I've tried to give you a fair hearing, but you've made it clear that you're not interested in having an honest conversation. You're only interested in playing the victim and attacking anyone who dares to ask you a difficult question." The declaration that the interview was over sent shockwaves through the studio. In decades of late-night television, hosts simply didn't end interviews mid-conversation, no matter how contentious they became. It was an unprecedented breach of television protocol that left everyone stunned and uncertain about what would happen next. Markle's response was swift and dramatic. She stepped back from Colbert's desk, her eyes blazing with triumph and fury in equal measure. "Fine," she said, her voice carrying across the silent studio like a battle cry. "I don't need to sit here and be insulted by someone who's clearly threatened by strong women who refuse to be silenced." She began walking toward the side of the stage where she had entered, her movements sharp and purposeful. But she wasn't finished delivering her parting shots. As she walked, she turned back toward Colbert and the audience, her voice carrying clearly through the studio's microphones. "This is exactly why women like me have to write our own stories," she called out, her voice echoing through the stunned silence. "Because men like Stephen Colbert will never give us the respect or platform we deserve. They'll always find ways to diminish us, to question our experiences, and to make us the villains in stories they've written without our consent." The accusation was devastating in its scope and implications. She had essentially accused Colbert, and by extension the entire late-night television establishment, of systematic sexism and racism. It was a nuclear option that would reverberate far beyond this single disastrous interview. As she reached the edge of the stage, she paused for one final moment, turning back to face the cameras and the stunned audience. Her expression was a mixture of rage, satisfaction, and something that looked almost like pity for the people she was leaving behind. "America needs to wake up and recognize what's happening here," she said, her voice now carrying the tone of someone delivering a sermon rather than concluding an interview. "This is what happens when powerful men feel threatened by women who refuse to stay in their assigned roles. Well, I'm done playing those games." With that final declaration, she walked off the stage, leaving behind a studio full of shocked audience members, bewildered production staff, and a host who stood frozen behind his desk, clearly struggling to process what had just occurred. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoed through the silence until she disappeared completely from view. Colbert remained standing behind his desk for several long seconds, his face cycling through emotions ranging from anger to confusion to something that might have been regret. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether they should applaud, boo, or simply remain quiet until someone told them what to do. Finally, Colbert seemed to remember that he was still on live television with cameras rolling and an audience waiting for some kind of response. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and looked directly into the camera with an expression that was both defiant and deeply shaken. "Well," he said, his voice barely steady, "that was certainly unexpected." We'll be right back after these messages. As the show cut to commercial break, the studio remained in stunned silence. Everyone present knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented in the history of late-night television. A complete breakdown of the normal rules and boundaries that govern celebrity interviews. The confrontation had revealed ugly truths about both participants that neither would likely ever be able to fully overcome, and the reverberations from this single disastrous interview would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling.